Good day, and thank you for joining. I am Sherilyn Francis, and on behalf of the Morehouse School of Medicine Prevention Research Center, we welcome you to part 6 of the Family Strong virtual series. Additionally, we encourage you to connect with us via we encourage you to connect with the MSM PRC via your favorite social media platform using the hashtag FamStrong20. The mission of the Morehouse School of Medicine, PRC, is to advance scientific knowledge in the field of prevention in African American and other minority communities, and to disseminate new information and strategies of prevention. The MSM PRC strongly holds to the applied definition of community based research, which is dynamic, encourages community and research entity partnerships, is focused on prevention, is tailor made, is ethnically and culturally focused, and prioritizes health policy to advance health equity. I now present to you part 6 of the FamStrong 20 series entitled Our Hearts and Minds, Mental Health and Social Isolation. Today's presenters will be Dr. Gilbert Bastian and Ms. Emanuela Elise Alce. And now Dr. Bastian, actually, I apologize. We will begin with a question. So in the chat box, can you please indicate the top 3 emotions that you have felt during the past 30 days? So in the chat box, just type out the top 3 emotions that you have felt in the past 30 days. And while you are entering your top 3 emotions, Dr. Bastian will take control of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Sharon. It's good to be on. Looking forward to a good discussion. So I'm taking a look here at folks' responses. Sadness over the death of Chadwick Boseman. Absolutely, what a shocking loss. Definitely can understand that, but also some excitement, some happiness, love, isolation, aloneness. Definitely, definitely appreciate the feedback that's coming in and all familiar emotions. Disgust. Yeah, I would love to hear more about that. Optimism. It's something to be able to say that in the midst of all that we're swimming through as a society right now. Optimism. So it's good to see there's a nice balance of some challenging emotions, but also some things on the lighter side. Definitely good. Well, good evening, everyone. It's really great to be with folks. It looks like a lot of what's being expressed are things that are going to be central to the discussion that we've prepared. I'll start off just laying out some background and providing some framework for our discussion around thinking about mental health and social isolation in particular. And then I'll pass it off to my co-presenter, Emanuela, who's going to share a bit more from a personal perspective around our topic for the day. And so we're looking forward to hearing from all of you once we've gone through what we've prepared and to be able to discuss what what comes to mind for you and what questions arise. So let's see. Charlotte, it's not exactly responding to.
Not a problem. I can transition your slides.
I think, okay, here we go. All right, so let's get rolling. So, obviously we're having this conversation in the context of right now an ongoing and active pandemic. And with that, it brings some particular things for us to think about around mental health. So I kind of wanted to start us off there with our discussion for today. So there are a lot of things that are coming up for folks right now, whether we're feeling the direct kind of hit or impact from what's going on with COVID-19 or whether it's hitting us more indirectly. There's a lot of stuff that's getting stirred up. We're obviously all dealing with fears around getting sick in the first place, of dying potentially, of losing loved ones, right? Folks are really afraid to even go in for routine health care right now because of fears of contracting the virus. There's some very serious financial issues that we're dealing with folks being laid off, furloughs. There's a real sense of losing power in the midst of all this. And we know that as human beings, when we feel like our sense of control and power is being lost, that really creates a lot of discomfort for us. And then you layer onto all of that this other parallel pandemic with what's going on with the political climate in our country right now, with the racial tensions that are constantly being stirred up. You can hardly digest one event before the next one is at our doorstep. And so it's understandable that a lot would be getting stirred up for us emotionally and mentally right now. Next slide. But one thing in particular, we can go on to the next slide, Sherilyn. So one thing in particular that this is bringing to the fore has to do with social isolation. Social isolation is a thing that, you know, many of us are familiar with in one way or another, and relatedly, you know, it can stir up feelings of loneliness that I think are really being ramped up by what we're dealing with right now with COVID. So even before COVID, for a bit of context and background, there was starting to be a discussion of loneliness as a new epidemic in the US. It's this idea that, you know, right now we're living in smaller families than ever before. Folks are having less children. We've got higher rates of people living single or folks getting divorced. And so for a lot of reasons, we're seeing folks spending more time by themselves. But now with all that's been introduced with COVID, I think a lot of those issues are being kind of magnified. And we know in the health space and in public health, especially, that there are a lot of other consequences that can come along with social isolation and feelings of loneliness. But I thought it was important to distinguish those two, right? Because a lot of times people use them interchangeably, but they're not exactly the same idea. So when we talk about loneliness, we're looking at that felt state, that feeling that we have that we're not as connected socially, you know, we're not as connected with others as we would like to be, and we feel some sense of dissatisfaction with that. So that gets at loneliness, which is more of an emotional state. So social isolation, on the other hand, has more to do with, you know, whether there are folks around us that we are connected to. And one doesn't necessarily have to go along with the other, right? So you can feel lonely even though you're not exactly socially isolated. It's the reason we talk about, you know, you can be in a room full of people and still feel lonely, right? That idea. And in the same vein, you can actually be pretty well connected with a lot of folks, but still feel a sense of loneliness. And so the two are not exactly necessarily the same. It's also important to think about whether you're choosing to spend some time alone, which is more of that solitude that we talk about, which sometimes can be helpful for our mental health, or whether you feel like you're having to be on your own, which gets into more of the isolation piece that can actually lead to some problems for us in terms of our mental health. So those, I think, are important separations, and where COVID comes into play, where there's a way in which we do feel like this is being kind of forced on us and imposed on us, right? It's not that we're choosing to not be able to go to church, to not be able to be around our families, but we're having to do that because of the threat of the virus, right? And so that brings extra challenges, right? As compared to if we're the ones in the driver's seat choosing to take some time apart. So we're being challenged to balance that very human need that we all have to be connected, right? We are not the kind of animal that thrives or does well on an island. We need others. We need some sort of connection to feel our best. And right now we're being challenged to figure out how to do that while still staying safe, right? What we also know is that there are disparities that exist when it comes to social isolation and loneliness and the effects that those things can have on health, right? There's more and more research coming out to show that for folks who report feeling lonely, report being socially isolated, we can see higher rates of certain physical health conditions. And we see that connection even more prominently, for example, when we look at Black folks as compared to other populations. We see that connection more prominently and our elderly population as compared to other communities. And so there are ways in which this phenomenon is hitting different groups differently that will be important for us to think about. Next slide. I think there's a little bit of a delay. So often when I talk about mental health, I emphasize that we can be so much more productive if we're thinking proactively about ways to get ahead of mental health challenges rather than being caught being reactive and having to deal with the crisis once it's in our lap. So I do want to move us to thinking about some proactive strategies to get ahead of these challenges. Next slide. And as I go through these, you'll notice that some of these are things that we can manage on our own, but there are times when we have to look to other supports, right? So one of the things that's really important is being tuned in to what's going on with us, right? So really taking the time to monitor ourselves to notice, something's kind of off with me right now. I feel like I'm spending a lot more time on my own than, would be normal. Even if I take into consideration what's going on with COVID, it seems like I really am isolating a lot more than feels healthy right now. So it's important that we be tuned in to what are the norms for me, and when I step outside of that, as a clue that there may be something there worth looking at. But also we have a responsibility to one another as a part of families, as a part of communities, to look to see where there might be opportunities to intervene if someone around us is feeling lonely, isolated. And we can start this with even training up kids from the time they're young, right? If they're noticing that one of their peers on the playground is kind of off on the side doing their own thing and not really engaged with others, it's a good opportunity to train them up to look out for each other, to go see what's going on with that kid, and to hopefully extend those practices beyond the childhood years of looking in on each other. The other thing that's really important is watching what's happening with the thought world, right? We talk about this idea of stinking thinking. There are definitely ways in which getting stuck in negative thought traps, getting stuck in the cycle of being our worst critic can actually make things really worse when it comes to mental health, when it comes to our sense of connection to others. So we really have to be creative, right? We've talked about the ways that COVID is kind of limiting what we're able to do, but it's not impossible for us to find ways to stay connected in this time. Even if, as I look at my own experience over the past couple months, I've had more Zoom powwows with girlfriends from college and sorority sisters and having family birthdays with nieces and nephews than I've ever had before, right? And so we really are having to think creatively about how it is that we stay in touch so that we feed that part of ourselves that depends on being connected, being a part of a broader village. And as we think about ways to tend to ourselves, sometimes that will give us ideas about ways to stay connected, right? If there are activities that help to recharge and renew you, if that's exercise, that could be a way to connect, right? We're being reminded constantly to stay socially distant. Maybe it's meeting at the park with a friend and taking a walk while we're 6 feet apart. Maybe it's setting up a lunch date with a colleague where we meet out in the park, we bring our packed lunches and we sit, at a decent distance and are able to catch up and check in. So we really are having to think outside of the box, but recognizing that sometimes, despite our best efforts, it doesn't seem like things are feeling better. And sometimes it's okay, and there shouldn't be shame around looking to get some additional support, some additional help. Next slide. So some additional strategies to consider about ways that we can be proactive in helping ourselves to stay mentally well during this time. Again, really checking those negative thoughts, looking at strategies like relaxation, prayer, meditation, really leaning on our faith right now is major in keeping ourselves in a good headspace. Look into those supports, exercising, eating well, getting the right things to nurture and feed us are really important. A couple other things off of this script that came to mind to me as I was thinking about this is sometimes, a slight shift in mindset around loneliness can make a big difference, right? So if we view our time alone as something that we're choosing and something that we're doing as active solitude to help ourselves get better, it doesn't impact us negatively in the same way that it does if we see it as, oh my God, nobody cares, nobody's looking in on me. And so the simple act of saying, this is my time to do X, to watch these YouTube videos on how to cook that meal I wanted to, can be really helpful. Another sort of technique or strategy that I will sometimes share with folks has to do with, and this is going to sound a little silly, but it's called the third person technique. And it's the idea that you sort of reference what you're thinking or what you're feeling in the third person. Like, in my case, I'm Gigi. I would say, Gigi feels like nobody wants to hang out right now. Gigi feels like she's alone in this moment. And something about saying that in the third person buys us a little bit of space and distance from our thoughts and a little bit of perspective in a way that research has demonstrated can be really helpful. So just wanted to leave you with some of those ideas. Next slide. But there is a point at which, as I mentioned, you may notice, okay, I've thrown some things at this, but it seems like there's a little bit more here than I can manage on my own, right? So if you're feeling this really intense sense of loneliness, feeling really isolated, more often than not, right? Spending more of the day in that state, that may be a clue that, okay, I may need a little more support than I can manage on my own. If it starts to bleed over and affect how you're operating at work, how you're functioning at home and at school. Those are all ideas, indicators, signs that we may need some extra support. And certainly if you find yourself trying to cope with that sense of loneliness by turning to things like drinking, drug use, that's a definite telltale sign that it's time to turn to someone else. And it's easier to fall into those traps when we don't have someone around. If we live alone, for example, to check us and say, hey, maybe that's one too many glasses of wine or what have you. So these are some clues that we can look to let us know when extra supports are needed. Next slide. So again, when we feel that sense of overwhelmed emotion around our state of isolation, that can be an important indicator to reach out for professional support, right? If we're finding it hard to get through our regular day-to-day activities, not motivated to get up out of the bed, to take a shower, to get dressed for your usual routine. These are all signs that, it's time to activate that next level, that next tier of getting myself back right. And certainly if we start to feel a sense of hopelessness that leads us to start to thinking, maybe I don't need to be here anymore, or, thoughts of harming self or others. Those are, I would say approaching the final stages of it's time to call in the reinforcements and to get some extra hands on deck. Next slide. So I wanted to share some resources, should you find yourself to meeting that state, or friends, family, folks in your world that you're noticing that isolation is heading to that intractable direction. This is a really good resource, the Georgia COVID support line that they've stood up really in the context of the pandemic, where 24/7 this line is manned. You can call and someone will be on the other line. And sometimes it just helps to have a quick check-in with someone who's kind of outside of your head, outside of the things that you're thinking, who can help strategize, who can help think about next steps and how you get the support that you need. So definitely recommend that folks jot down this number and share it with the folks in your world. Next slide. Some additional resources or a number of different crisis lines. The Georgia Crisis Line is one that's been around for a long time as a resource. But then there are additional supports that have been set up, in the midst of the pandemic, and ones that are geared more towards disaster type situations and sort of broad scale emergencies. The crisis text line is one that I like to recommend for our teens and our younger folks. These are resources that are staffed and manned 24/7 by trained mental health professionals who are readily available to help guide folks through, here's what I'm thinking, what should I do? And they can walk you through resources in your area. So definitely encourage folks to make use of these. Next slide. So with that, I will welcome Emanuela, who's going to share a bit more from a personal perspective. It's one thing to kind of hear me kind of lay out what we know from the research and from my experiences working with clients, but it's always helpful to hear a personal account of some of the things that we've been talking about. So Emanuela, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gigi. Hi, everybody. I hope you guys can hear me clearly. Um, Great. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about my own experience with social isolation um, and mental health in general, just to give some perspective. And it also helps to know that we all go through these things as well, and we're not alone. So for me, this year, well, maybe last year, I should say, I was experiencing a lot of issues with my mental health. I was depressed and I started getting anxiety, and I isolated myself a lot from my friends and my family, and I wanted to be alone. Part of that was definitely the depression, but also I felt like I needed to center myself and take time for myself, to disconnect from all the pressures that I had, things that were impacting my life, from work stress, life stress, and in the age of social media, we start seeing what other people are doing. Hello. We see what other people are doing, um, and we start to compare. When you look on Facebook or Twitter or wherever, and we start to compare. And sometimes we're not even on social media, it's happening within our families. We compare ourselves to where our family members are. So all of that, I was dealing with all of that, and I isolated myself from that. I decided that I was going to take a step back, not be exposed to social media, not be exposed to spaces where I felt weak, enough to compare myself to what others were doing, and I started feeling bad. So I felt like I wasn't mentally and emotionally strong to face that, so I isolated myself. But in the process of doing that as well, I became more depressed. It gives the depression room to grow. So I reached out to my therapist. I went to therapy to help me deal with that. They gave me coping techniques, a lot of which Gigi mentioned already. And it was still not helping me. So I went on an antidepressant and I started getting better. And slowly exposing myself back to all those things that I took a step back from. And COVID-19 happened. 2020 happened. It's been a rough year from the beginning. Um, Different death, people dying, Kobe's death and his daughter's death, all of that hit me pretty hard. And then we went into COVID-19, and that came with it the impact of like imposed isolation. I was already isolated, so you would think, yes, she's fine. She's gonna be okay. I'm thinking I can deal with this, and this is for the good of my family. I have parents that live with me that are high risk at high risk for the disease. So I was not gonna go to work. I was gonna do what is necessary to keep them safe and isolate myself. Well, when I'm the one that chooses to isolate myself is one thing. When it's the government or just like a crisis like COVID-19 that says, oh no, you cannot go out, you need to stay in, it's a different level, because now you have to start thinking about what's absolutely necessary for me to do. And you go down the list. I have to go to the market. I have to get my groceries. Not everybody has the luxury or the means to get it delivered. So that's something you have to take care of. If you have to go to the doctor, if you have to go get medicine, and if you have to There are errands that you still need to do for your day-to-day life. Maybe it's your license that you need to get renewed. All these things. So it's going through the list of saying, should I check this off? Should I be able to keep doing this? And it weighs on you. And then you add people dying, people getting sick, being exposed to that. And on top of that, within the Black community, African American community, around the same time, we're learning of the death of Ahmaud Arbery. And then we had George Floyd, and up to recently, just now, Jacob Blake being shot 7 times in the back. Just all those worries on top of the regular racism that you deal with. It impacts me. And me personally, because I work with a group of social justice activists and 10 Demands activists calling for help for the Black community, for changes to improve our lives from just the way we are affected by police brutality, police violence, and our lack of access or resources that has nothing to do with us. It's just part of systemic racism. I'm immersed so much into my activism and that I deal with it every day. I face it and it weighs heavy on me. And I feel myself getting crushed and I feel myself getting depressed again. And when that happens, I have to take a step back. I have to analyze it and say, hey, I'm sad, I'm angry. And it happens so much right now. And this morning to wake up to news of Chadwick passing away and I realized like what he's been dealing with these past 4 years and all he accomplished during that time. But also I'm on Twitter and to see how people are reacting to his death and his life, and some using it for political gains. And it almost feel like Black lives can be meaningless. People just use them to make their own points. And it's sad. And we are disconnected. We are isolated from each other. It's hard to connect physically right now. So we have to take a step back sometimes from all these things. When we get too angry, when we get too sad, or just feel the pain, whatever it is, we need to take a step back. And if it's to stay off Twitter, to stay off the social media, do that and reach out to somebody. Make sure, because we still can talk to people, we still can text. And of course there's Zoom, which is great. We can still see people face to face. Use those things to help us kind of reconnect and deal with that sense of loneliness and sense of isolation. And know that it's okay. And if you feel that way, it's also okay to reach out and get help. And when it comes to these resources, I think they are great. I want to go a little extra, is to find a partner, a friend, a really close friend, or a family member, whoever it is that you can share what you're going through with and say, you know what, if I'm not feeling well, I'm going to reach out to you and say, you know what, I need help. Come to me. Come help me. And have that emergency plan for somebody to rescue you sometimes. Because also I know as Black people, what we may deal with, I don't feel like I can call 911, but do not get the help that you need because you're feeling scared or because you feel ashamed. So I hope that helps. Those are my little ways of coping with it and stuff.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that powerful experience. Next slide, Chair Linda. I thought it was really important for folks to kind of hear from how you've dealt with these experiences. It makes all the difference. So just wanted to recap a couple points from that, I think you said it best in terms of taking a step back. And sometimes the thing we need is to put things in perspective. Because sometimes what really takes us down is feeling overwhelmed and just feeling like we're drowning in the emotions. And so being able to take that step back, whether that means taking a social media sabbatical to get some perspective, I think is important. Focusing on what we can control, right? That old serenity prayer that talks about God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. It's really tried and true wisdom that sometimes if we just zero in on what it is that we can do something about, that we have power over, that can be really helpful. And really the power of taking on a gratitude mindset, even in the midst of all that 2020 has thrown at us, and my goodness, it keeps throwing blows. There's still in the midst of that things that we can be grateful for, whether it's the fact that we woke up this morning, we've got a roof over our heads, whatever those things may be, getting in the habit of listing those out each day, asking ourselves, what is one thing that I can be grateful for and happy about today, I think goes a long way. To Emanuela's point, our resource list was not exhaustive, right? Everything was not on there. Sometimes it does help to have an accountability person, a trusted confidant in your world, and also to work one-on-one with a therapist or a counselor or someone who can help you get that perspective and help you strategize about next steps, and really creating those opportunities to practice positive coping using some of those strategies that we laid out. So hopefully there were some things in what we've discussed today that you'll find helpful. So at this point, I know that folks may have some questions for us, and Sherilyn, I'll let you lead the way in terms of where we go with that, but we're happy to take any questions from the group.
Wonderful. Thank you both, Dr. Bastian and Ms. Alcé, for your extremely engaging presentation. And Ms. Alcé, thank you for sharing that personal experience. You received a lot of positive feedback in the chat section. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you for sharing. Too often we don't share our experiences because mental health service seeking or emotional wellness service seeking is oftentimes stigmatized. So my first question is, how do we overcome the stigma in Black and Brown communities or under-resourced communities? How do we speak with our friends and family members about overcoming the stigma associated with mental and emotional well-being service seeking?
Absolutely. I'll start off and then let Emanuela weigh in. I think it starts with spaces like this, right? Creating space for having honest conversation about what mental health is, what it isn't. So doing some education around the challenges at hand, and then being brave enough to share our experiences. I can't tell you, as a psychologist, how many times I've worked with clients where they've worked up all this courage to like tell somebody in their world. I have a therapist that I meet with, and the person's like, yeah, I have one too, girl. I've been seeing her for 2 years, or except, but everybody's engaged in like this conspiracy of silence, where it's this hush hush secret. And so I think a critical step in really breaking down that stigma is making room for honest discussion. And in doing that, you don't only allow yourself to live in your truth, but you open the door and give an invitation for others to live in their truth and to feel like they can talk about those things. So that would be one of the ways to tackle that. Emanuela, anything you would add to that in terms of stigma? I mean, I know certainly in our Haitian American community, that's a particularly ripe one to deal with.
Yes, it can be really hard. It's just, for me, I was lucky to have you. And it's just finding that one person that you can talk to, or maybe it's at work, or maybe it's at school, or in your family, somebody that you can go to that you feel like you have that safe space to start you on the path of getting the help that you need when you feel like you need it. So if you have that, it gives you confidence to find the right path to getting better. And one thing that could help is realizing that mental health is as important as medical health, like for your body. Your mind suffers as well. It gets impacted by stress, it gets impacted by pain. How do you heal that? So getting access, giving yourself that freedom to go to a therapist, to go to a counselor, to help you heal the wounds of your mind, just like you would for your body if you had cancer, diabetes, or a headache. Giving yourself that freedom to do that is a great place to start, and removing the stigma.
Thank you. And we do have a question about the resources that you shared earlier, Dr. Bastian. Are those resources for persons who have insurance? Or have you simultaneously shared resources that are for persons who do not have health insurance?
Sure, that's a good question. So the hotlines are freely available to the public. And so the Georgia Crisis Line, the text message, the text line, those are things that, anybody can make use of. One of the resources that I referenced, the Employee Assistance Program, is a particular kind of benefit that folks sometimes have through their employers, that sometimes is attached to insurance, but sometimes is just a part of a benefit associated with being employed by a particular company. And so it varies, but that is a good question, because there are some restrictions in terms of what you can access without insurance, but there are more and more resources coming out. There's goodness, I'm drawing a blank on the Therapist for Black Girls. There's therapy for Black men. They have pages on Instagram that have been doing a lot of work, kind of compiling resources that are free or relatively low cost mental health services. And so I highly recommend folks look into those online directories to identify those providers that can provide supports even with different insurance situations.
Thank you. And another question: how can parents, aunts, uncles, even older siblings help children, as in persons under the age of 18, to maintain optimal mental health and emotional well-being during this time?
Emanuela, I'll let you take the lead on that. You're the parent.
Okay, so the first step as a parent is to recognize that it's stressful for us. So if it's stressful for us and overwhelming for us, it's going to be for them who do not understand it at all, or barely understand it, and they cannot grasp the impact of not being able to do something as simple as going to visit their friend, and why. So I talk with them as much as possible. I take them on walks, try to keep things as normal as possible, and things that I can't, we just have to teach them to learn how to accept it. But also, I create a space for them to be angry. I create a space for them to be sad, and say that it's okay. And when they cannot explain why they feel that way, I'm like, is it because of this? Is it because of that? Because they feel the emotion, but they don't understand why. So I try to give them the space for it and help them find the words for it. But my kids are 9, 7, and 4. But for the older kids, it may be a little bit easier.
Yeah, I think those are great ideas. I would reinforce a lot of that. And a lot of the same considerations hold true, right? So one has to do with what we model for them as parents, right? So if we model for them that, if I'm crying, I have to run away and hide it, you can't see it, that's sending a message about whether it's acceptable or not acceptable to have an emotional reaction. So I think, a lot of what we do speaks really more loudly than what we say when it comes to these things. So modeling for them what emotional wellness looks like, as Emanuela said, creating space, encouraging them to talk about how they feel about certain things certainly helps, but also recognizing the same things in terms of when have I met the limits of what I can manage, and when it's time to call in the reinforcements and to maybe work with the teacher and see what resources are available at the school, or to connect them with a provider outside of the school setting, becomes really important. But yeah, the children are being challenged right now just as much as the rest of us with what's going on. And so it's definitely important to pay attention to how they're dealing.
Thank you. Well, that is our time. We've actually gone a little over. I'm sorry, I do have one more question. This is from Joanna. She would like to know, how does one go about finding a therapist, particularly for young adults and women?
So one resource that I think is a good one is Psychology Today, and you could literally Google Psychology Today, and it'll pull up a website. They have a nationwide directory that can allow you to search for providers, and you can give it all kinds of parameters. If you want a female therapist, you want somebody who specializes in adolescent work, you want a female, you want somebody Black, you can give it all sorts of parameters, and it will provide you a list of folks based on your zip code, folks who are in your area. So that I think is a really good resource. There's also a Black clinicians, Black therapist resource that folks can access. Sometimes via Facebook, you can send a message. The group is Black clinicians on Facebook, Black therapy clinicians, and they have a separate sort of resource of Black providers, whether those are psychologists, psychiatrists, licensed professional counselors, that they share with folks. And then those resources that I shared earlier, where they have Instagram pages, Therapy for Black Girls, Therapy for Black Men. They're on Twitter and Instagram, and they also have separate kind of directories and networks of providers who tend to our communities. So those would be some of the main resources. And sometimes through your insurance, you can get a list of folks, through your health insurance, you can get a list of folks in your network who provide counseling services.
Thank you so much. So that is our time. And I will ask you, Ms. Alsace and Dr. Bastian, can you please give us a charge moving forward regarding maintaining our optimal mental and emotional health?
Absolutely. I'll kick that off. So, I know for many of us, and, I did a quick scan of at least the faces that I can see of the folks who tuned in, and there are a lot of women in the group. We tend to, I think, recognize that these are issues a bit more easily, and we have a certain space to raise the awareness about how important it is in our community. So I would challenge everyone to maybe open up a discussion about loneliness and isolation, and what folks are dealing with around that in your family is one charge, or in your circle of friends, the circle of folks that support you. And then the other thing, just recognizing that as women in particular, but for a lot of us, even beyond just women, our tendency is to sort of look out for other people, and part of what can create challenges is neglecting ourselves. So my charge would be, what's something that you can do to nurture you in the next 24 hours? And it could be something simple, like I'm gonna, binge watch a couple of those episodes of my favorite show on Netflix tonight, or I'm gonna pick up a phone and make a call to that old friend that I haven't talked to in a while to try to rekindle some old friendships. Or I'm gonna take a walk this evening before it gets dark, just to get a little bit of movement. But what's one thing that I can do in the next 24 hours as an act of kindness to myself? That would be my
Well, you basically covered it. My thing is self-care, self-care, self-care. And I'm saying this to myself as well. I haven't been taking care of myself this past week. I've been just basking and absorbing all the craziness of what's been going on, and I've been angry, and then I feel bad. So one thing is to allow ourselves to feel the feelings that we do, and then saying, I feel this way, what can I do about it? What would I tell somebody that I love to do about it? And then do it for yourself. That's what I would say.
Thank you. Thank you both for such a wonderful presentation. Today was an excellent discussion. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And to the family members who attended today's presentation, thank you for spending a portion of your afternoon with us. Thank you for attending today's presentation. On behalf of the Morehouse School of Medicine Prevention Research Center, we thank you for your attendance in today's webinar. And again, we encourage and invite you to connect with the PRC via your favorite social media platform using the hashtag FamStrong20. Have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everybody. Be well.